All right, so I think this is where we left off in the last class. So we started this chapter, I think it's chapter 12 in the Man-Q textbook on long-run economic growth. The first thing we did was that we examined some international data on cross-country living standards, and we discovered a couple of interesting things. One is that there are some countries where the average citizen is quite wealthy, and a bunch of other countries where the typical citizen is quite poor. So there's some rich countries and some poor countries, but there's also a great deal of variation in how quickly these countries are growing over time, right? Countries like China and India seem to be developing rapidly, whereas some other developed countries like Japan seem to be growing very slowly in recent decades. Now, we tried to argue or trace those differences in living standards across countries to differences in productivity. Let me throw that question out at you first. What do we mean by productivity? How do we quantify it in economics? You guys remember? How do we measure the productivity of a country's workforce? Anybody remember? Matt? Yeah, it's the amount of real output or income per unit of labor, right? Or per worker. So Y divided by L using the notation in our economic equations, okay? The idea is that as workers get more productive, output per worker is obviously going to increase, raising living standards. All of that makes sense, but it doesn't really get at the root causes of why rich countries have workers who are far more productive than workers from poor countries, right? And so we spent the last kind of several minutes of class talking about some of the key drivers of productivity in the long run. And we talked in detail about three of them, right? We have two types of capital, physical capital and human capital. And then we also spent some time talking about technological knowledge, right? What's the difference between physical and human capital? You recall? So physical capital is stuff like equipment and machinery that is used by workers to produce goods and services. What is human capital, though? Sean? That's right. That's basically kind of the skills that people have accumulated over time on the job or through their education or training. How is that different from technological knowledge? So those two they seem to be kind of related, but they're actually different. So technological knowledge, I argued, was probably the most important driver of productivity in the long run. What do we mean by technological knowledge as opposed to something like human capital? What's your name again? Wyatt, go ahead. Yeah, that's a really good way to describe it. So technological knowledge is kind of society's overall understanding about the best production processes, right? Whereas human capital is kind of, these are things that individuals make investments in, right? You guys are all here to get a college education, presumably to go off into a career and earn higher wages than you otherwise would. You would be making investments in your human capital. Okay, so we've established then that standard of living is very much driven by productivity, and productivity in turn depends deeply on things like physical and human capital and technological knowledge. What I would like to spend the first part of class today discussing are some actual, perhaps government policies that can help boost worker productivity and therefore living standards in the long run, okay? So if governments exist in part to try to improve our material standard of living, then the policies that governments devise, one might think, should be most conducive to trying to raise the productivity of our workforce in the long run. All right, so we'll touch on a few of these over the next 20 or 30 minutes. The first one I want to talk about, one kind of obvious way to raise the productivity of a country's workforce is to actually produce more physical capital, right? If worker productivity is in part driven by capital per worker, then it stands to reason that we can make workers more productive long term if we increase a country's capital stock. Now, you'll recall that physical capital is a produced factor of production, right? Meaning that physical capital is used to produce goods and services today, but at one point in the past, it was the output of the production process. Well, that tells us then that a country can raise its capital stock simply by devoting more of its resources to the production of capital goods. Is there a trade-off involved with this, though? If a country kind of collectively chooses to try to invest more of its resources to producing capital goods, equipment, machinery, warehouses, plants, factories, etc., are there certain things then, or certain types of goods that a country necessarily has to sacrifice or give up? The more capital we produce, what do we give up as a result of that? And what's the other type of major good that we tend to purchase? Not capital goods, but what? Consumer goods or consumption goods, right? So there is a trade-off. Producing more capital requires using more resources that we would otherwise use to produce consumption goods. So higher capital means lower consumption today. Now, of course, when you reduce your consumption today, you're necessarily going to be increasing your saving, okay? Now, a bit later on in the semester, we're going to spend a whole week talking about the financial system, okay? And one of the main results of our study of the financial system is this idea that when individuals and countries save, that those resources get channeled through the financial system in order to produce more capital goods, okay? So reducing consumption is basically the same as increasing saving and helps us produce more investment and capital goods, okay? So if you want to, another kind of clever way to think about this trade-off is that, yes, we can produce more capital goods and we're going to have to give up some of our current consumption goods. However, if our country produces more capital, then that means we should be able to produce more of all types of goods and services in the future, right? Including consumption. So one way of thinking about this trade-off is between current and future consumption. This is actually one of the most important trade-offs studied in the field of macroeconomics. This idea that there is a trade-off between current and future consumption. If you save more today to invest in the capital stock, you're going to consume fewer goods and services today, but that's going to allow everybody to consume more goods and services in the future. So there's an intertemporal trade-off that is between current and future consumption. Let me ask you guys this question. So I don't have this in the slides, but can you think of any programs or government policies, or perhaps even certain elements of our tax code that might help promote savings and investment? If economists argue that greater savings leads to greater capital, which helps increase the productivity of the workforce and raise standards of living, are there certain types of policies or features of the tax code that might actually promote greater savings as opposed to simply greater consumption? Matt? Yeah, so companies can sometimes get these investment tax credits where their tax liability will fall if they pledge to use those extra dollars to form more capital stock and make workers more productive. Simply lowering the corporate income tax rate might actually promote increases in capital formation. But also there are things that can promote saving among households as well. You guys may not have one of these yet, but when you go off and start your first job in your career, you'll likely be offered by your employer a 401k plan or an individual retirement account, an IRA, okay? These are savings vehicles that households can use that incentivize saving, right? By allowing you to lower your taxable income by putting a certain amount of funds into these accounts. So certainly one thing the government could do to incentivize more saving is by kind of raising the cap on how much money we can contribute to our individual retirement plans or our 401k plans tax-free. So there's a variety of different types of policies, but any of them that are geared towards helping society try to save more and consume a little less should help increase capital and productivity in the long run. Okay, so saving and investment by domestic residents, that's what we've basically been talking about so far, is not the only way to increase the capital stock. It turns out that residents of foreign countries can also invest in domestic capital formation, right? We live in a global economy after all, okay? Now, economists basically recognize two types of foreign investment, and we're going to talk more about these in much greater detail later in the semester when we devote a whole section of the course to talking about open economy, macroeconomic concepts. But for right now, I think it's good enough just to understand that, yes, if we save more, that should increase capital, but actually we can receive savings, and the United States does, from the rest of the world. And that helps boost the capital stock here domestically. There's basically two ways that that can happen: through something called a foreign direct investment, or alternatively, something called a foreign portfolio investment. Let me just talk briefly about the differences between those two. So,
slow down.
That's not me, right? That's somebody who's not muted. So does mute all not mute all? Allow participant. No, I don't want to do that. Okay. Oh, mute all. No, allow participants to unmute themselves. Ah. Huh? Unclick this. Allow participants to unmute themselves. So I don't want to, or this is way too confusing. There's way too many like double negatives here. Allow, yes or no. This is all screwed up. So I want to hit yes now. Okay. I don't want anyone to shout something embarrassing in the middle of class. That's what I want to avoid. Okay. Okay, back to the slide. So a foreign direct investment is a capital investment that is owned and operated by a foreign entity. Okay, so think of something like a factory or a warehouse. I think the great example here locally would be the Mercedes plant, right? This is a German-owned operation, but it is operated domestically here in the United States. It doesn't raise the productivity of the German workforce, it raises the productivity of the US workforce. That is a foreign direct investment. A foreign portfolio investment is slightly different. That is a capital investment that is actually just financed with foreign money, but it's operated by and owned by domestic residents. So imagine a German citizen in Berlin was to purchase a bond issued by the General Electric Corporation, a US company. All right, that would be an example of a foreign portfolio investment where a foreign citizen is basically just financing our own domestic investment. A foreign direct investment is where that investment is made directly by a foreign entity or company. How many of you guys have heard, why can't I do this? have heard of the international organizations, the World Bank or the IMF. Surely you have, right? Now, both of these organizations do a lot of different things today, but they were originally set up basically to help funnel foreign investment from rich countries to poor and underdeveloped countries by helping to encourage things like foreign direct and foreign portfolio investments. Okay, one other thing that governments can do to help improve productivity and living standards in the long run is by promoting what I'll just call education initiatives. So 2 examples are to fund high quality public schools that most of you probably went to, right? Or to provide subsidized loans to college students, which many of you may actually have. Okay, now why or how is it that those 2 types of programs should increase productivity in the long run? What is the government making an investment in? Not physical capital, but Sean, in human capital, right? So these types of education initiatives are designed to help promote greater human capital among the citizenry, therefore increasing their productivity in the long run. There's a ton of empirical work in economics that tries to analyze or estimate how much a worker's lifetime earnings goes up as a result of each extra year of education. Okay, there's lots and lots of papers written about this in the field of labor economics in particular. If you look at most of those studies, the average or the median sometimes is usually around like 10%. So most studies show that in fact, greater investments in education do raise a worker's lifetime income by as much as about 10%. So these investments in fact do work and do make workers more productive. One thing I do want to emphasize here is that just like physical capital, investing in human capital involves this intertemporal trade-off between current and future consumption. All right, this is probably very obvious for you guys if you think about it. By going to college full-time, you're not able to enter into the workforce full-time, right? You're going to give up some wages, that's your opportunity cost, and as a result, today you're not going to be able to consume as many goods and services. But later on, after you have fully attained your college education, you're going to go off into your career and earn a much higher wage and be able to afford far more goods and services later on in your life. So just like investments in physical capital, investments in human capital involve this trade-off between current and future consumption, right? It's also relevant for both types of capital. Now, interestingly, I think you can apply this concept of trade-offs between current and future consumption to better understand a chronic problem that we tend to see in the underdeveloped world, particularly in countries that are experiencing widespread poverty. And that is this problem of children as young as 10, 11, 12 years old dropping out of school and entering the workforce. Why is that going on? Well, I would argue that it's not because the parents in these impoverished countries are bad parents, right? It's because every hour of that kind of child labor is needed in order to support the family, right? The opportunity cost of going to school is too high. The trade-off between current and future consumption is just way too severe, particularly in these poor and underdeveloped countries. Now, one of the common ways you see the rich world responding to these types of events is that, some celebrity will get outraged that their clothing or their jewelry or whatever was manufactured using child labor. And a lot of people would want to boycott these multinational corporations. Well, let's say worst case scenario, that as a result of these mass boycotts, some of these companies that tend to utilize child labor went out of business or moved production or just stopped production altogether. What do you think is likely to happen to the children who are actually working in those factories, sewing up sneakers or clothing? John? Well, I don't want to go that far, but I guess that's a possibility. But do you think that those kids are probably going to say, well, there's no factory here to work in, I'm going to go to school now? No, they're going to go to the next best available job where the wages are a little bit lower, the working conditions are a little bit worse. Okay, so I'm not saying that these boycotts and protests aren't useful to some extent to spread awareness about these problems, but it's not a cure for child labor, right? We cured child labor in this country not because we have strict laws against it, but because our economy grew to a certain level where enough people were prosperous that they didn't have to send their kids out into the fields to work on the farm all year long, right? And so that's kind of the more of the cure for eliminating these types of problems with child labor is economic growth and investments in human capital. Here's a quick graph I'll show you that I think illustrates nicely this correlation we see between human capital and living standards. So we've got GDP per capita on the vertical axis and average years of schooling here on the horizontal axis. Each of these dots is a different country. And what do you tend to see? That for countries that have higher average years of schooling of their citizens, they also tend to be the countries that have higher levels of per capita real GDP. Now you may say maybe there's some reverse causation there, that rich countries can afford to send their children and young adults to school and college. That's certainly the case, but it's the positive relationship between those two is kind of undeniable. Okay, I think something else that is extremely important, but perhaps not talked about enough when it comes to long-run economic growth, is that in order to sustain growth, governments need to be able and willing to set up what I call the right types of institutions for economic growth. Okay, now what do I mean by institutions here? You can think of these as basically like the rules of the game that structure incentives among participants in an economy. Okay, there's lots of different kind of growth institutions that we could talk about. I think there's maybe 4 are the most important. So economists and historians have generally tend to agree that these 4 are really conducive to countries experiencing rapid growth in the long run. The first is property rights, in particular, a government's willingness and ability to protect private property rights. Having an honest government, right? One that tries to minimize corruption as much as possible is important for experiencing growth in the long run. Political stability. Countries that are highly unstable politically are not typically the countries that experience strong growth records over the long run. And fourth is having a dependable legal system, in particular, a legal system that we can trust that will enforce private contracts between parties. These are the 4 kind of basic growth institutions that most economists think are critical in order for countries or economies to prosper in the long run. If you think about it, without these basic institutions, there is very little private incentive for a market-based approach to long-run prosperity, right? Let's say that Sean here is an entrepreneur and he's considering expanding his production to Somalia, okay? You work globally. You're not likely going to be willing as an entrepreneur to take the risks necessary to expand your production abroad if you think that the government of Somalia is not going to protect your property rights. If you're afraid that that on a whim, government officials could come in and basically expropriate all of your resources, you're not likely going to be able to want to make an investment in that country, right? Or alternatively, Sean, if you have to pay a bribe to a government official every time you conduct a transaction, you're not likely to make those investments in that country. Or political stability, or a dependable legal system, right? These are the institutions that are kind of necessary conditions for countries experiencing growth in the long run. In a lot of ways, they're even more important than simply expanding the amount of capital, physical or human capital, available in a country. It's these types of institutions that we need to make sure are working from the get-go in order for a country to experience growth long term. Here's a couple of interesting tables I want to show you. So the World Bank publishes this thing called a corruption index for every country in the world. And in 2019, the top 10 least corrupt countries in the world: Denmark, New Zealand, Finland, Sweden, Switzerland, Singapore, Norway, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Germany. These are 10 of the world's richest countries. They have honest governments. Here are the 10 most corrupt countries in the world in 2019. Somalia, South Sudan, Syria, Yemen, Venezuela, Afghanistan, North Korea, etc. It is not surprising that these are among some of the world's poorest countries in terms of standards of living, right? So having an honest government is extremely important for providing the right kind of conditions necessary for growth. You'll notice that our country is not in the top 10. I'm not sure exactly where we're ranked, but these Nordic countries and some of these other Western European countries have less corruption, according to the World Bank, than we do. Here's a picture that I think makes it even more visible. So it's the same data with every country in the world. And as you see, as corruption increases, standards of living as measured by per capita real GDP decline, right? The poorest countries in the world are also some of the most brutally corrupt, whereas the richest countries in the world are also the ones that tend to have the least amount of corruption. It's not a perfect kind of one-to-one correlation, but you definitely see this negative trend. Okay, one reason why economics is a difficult subject to do research on is because it's oftentimes impossible for us to do controlled experiments like a real scientist would to test our various theories, okay? But every once in a while, history provides us with a unique set of events or circumstances that can help us kind of validate or refute certain types of economic theories or ideas, okay? Here is an example of one that I think helps us understand how important, or test our understanding of this belief that growth institutions matter. You guys know what this is a picture of? Say it again. Yeah, so this is a satellite image of the Korean Peninsula by night, okay? Now, about 70 or 75 years ago, just by kind of historical chance, the Korean Peninsula was divided in two between the North and the South, okay? Now, at the time, the North and South Korea were not surprisingly very, very similar, okay? They had the same type of geography, basically the same natural resources, the same culture, the same ethnicity. They were closer two countries than any other two countries in the world, okay? Yet over the next several decades, one of those countries, one part of the Korean Peninsula developed rapidly, that is the South, as indicated by the modern electrical grid, right? At night, almost the whole country is lit up, okay? The other part of the country, the North, however, didn't grow at all right? And that's indicated by what are basically blackout conditions over the entire nation, except right there in Pyongyang, where the dictator lives. Okay. Now, why did this happen? Well, South Korea adopted a market-based approach to prosperity, to economic growth, right? A market-based approach preaches fidelity to those growth institutions that I talked about, an honest government, the protection of property rights, etc. Okay? North Korea adopted a completely different economic system, communism, which essentially rejects those four growth institutions. So this history here provides us with a very dramatic and stark example of the importance of those basic growth institutions to helping promote economic prosperity in the long run, even more so than simply having more capital, more human capital, and improvements in technology. If your country and in your government is unwilling to do things like protect private property and have an honest government and a dependable legal system, it's very unlikely that standards of living are going to increase over time very much. Okay, I tell you what, let me stop here. The last couple of slides are about the importance of inward versus outward oriented policies with regards to how countries interact with the rest of the world, all right? It's not surprising that most economists believe that countries that adopt these outward oriented policies, where they try to reduce trade barriers and integrate more with the rest of the world, tend to be those countries that grow more rapidly than the ones that are more inward oriented. North Korea would be an extreme example of an inward oriented country. And then lastly, you know, technology, of course, is important for productivity in the long run. And so I talk a little bit here, and you can read this in the textbook, about this idea that technologies are oftentimes the output of things like research and development. And so certain types of government policies that we can adopt to help improve or grow the state of technology would be things like, you know, enhancements to patent laws or tax incentives to provide support for R&D, or even grants for basic research at universities. Technological improvements are really, really important because technology, unlike consumption, is a public good, right? One company's use of a production process doesn't necessarily preclude the rest of the country's use of those same types of ideas. So policies that help promote R&D and therefore help boost the level of technology and economy are also really important as well. I'll let you guys kind of, I know I could only talk about that for a minute or two, but I'll let you guys look at those on your own, and then there's a good section of the textbook that explains that in greater detail. But I want to give you guys enough time to at least get started on the extra credit assignment. So why don't you guys upload this worksheet in Excel called Growth Projections for the US. And there is also a set of instructions that go along with it that I think are available on Blackboard, but I can pass these. I've got paper copies of them if you want. This is a pretty straightforward exercise. So let me kind of describe what you're going to be doing here, and then I'll leave you for the rest of the class to work on it on your own. Actually, let me make sure that our Zoom folks can see it. Hold on. Okay, so this exercise basically asks you to do the following. In the first column of the Excel worksheet, I've already given you data on per capita real GDP from 1948 all the way through 2019, okay? The first thing I'm going to have you do is to compute in column C the annual growth rate of per capita real GDP using the formula that is stated in the instructions. As you compute the growth rate of real GDP, it should graph automatically for you over in this illustration here. So you don't actually have to construct those graphs yourself. It should do it for you automatically. Then I want you to do the following two things, which are called counterfactual studies in economics. All right. The first one is basically the following question. If we were to go back in time and start in 1973, and if GDP per capita were to grow at the rate that it did on average during the first part of this sample, from 1948 through 1972, what would per capita GDP look like today, and I say today, in 2019? And then alternatively, if you go back to 1949 and instead assume that the US economy grew at the rate that it did after 1973 every year, what would per capita income levels look like today? Now, if you do this exercise right, what you're going to find is that fairly modest differences in growth rates compounded over time in the long run are going to lead to really large differences in standards of living after many, many years. All right, that's what we mean by a counterfactual projection, is to go back in time and say, well, let's assume that the US economy did this. Where would we be today? Instead, let's assume that the US economy did something else. How rich would the average citizen be today? So why don't you guys work on that, and then as you finish, just save your Excel file and then send it to my email address. And if you don't finish it before you leave class today, that's fine, as long as I get it back from you before class on Thursday. Okay? Who needs a physical copy of this? And I'll walk around and hand these out. Anybody on this row need one? One. Okay. Oops.